Rain has a way of ruining things you didn't know were fragile. I learned that on the morning of my first day at Hargrove, an associate standing outside the revolving glass doors of a building that gleamed like a polished threat, watching the sky open up in a way that felt personally directed at me. My umbrella, the cheap foldable one I'd had since college, the one with the broken third rib that made it list slightly to the left, was sitting on my kitchen counter. I could picture it exactly. Propped against the fruit bowl, next to the 2 bananas I'd told myself I would eat this week and wouldn't. I had a choice. Stand under the awning and wait for the rain to stop, which the clouds above showed no intention of doing, or make a run for it and arrive to my first day looking like I'd been fished out of a river. I stood there, calculating, one hand clutching my portfolio bag to my chest like it was a life preserver. "You're blocking the entrance." The voice came from behind me, low, completely flat, carrying all the warmth of a filing cabinet. I turned around and found the most severe-looking man I had ever seen, standing approximately 2 feet away, holding a large black umbrella, his coat perfectly dry. His expression suggesting that I was a minor inconvenience in an already tedious universe. He was tall. Sharp jaw, dark hair pushed back from his forehead with the kind of effortlessness that takes real effort, eyes the color of storm clouds, which felt, at that moment, cosmically appropriate. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent and looked at me the way you look at a misplaced stapler. "Sorry," I managed. The rain." "I noticed the rain," he said. "I also noticed you standing in front of a door that other people need to use." I stepped to the side. He walked past me, through the revolving door, and disappeared into the lobby without a second glance. I stood there in the rain, which chose that exact moment to intensify, and thought, great, off to a fantastic start. I never imagined he worked in the same building. I certainly never imagined he'd end up mattering. My name is Sammy Glover. I was 26 that autumn, freshly hired as a junior copywriter at Hargrove and Associates, a mid-sized marketing firm on the 14th floor of a glass tower in the kind of city neighborhood that takes itself too seriously. I'd spent 2 years freelancing after graduating, building a portfolio piece by painstaking piece, and getting this job had felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for a very long time. I was not going to let one rude man with a perfect umbrella ruin that. Except, of course, he kept showing up. His name was Barry Potter. I found that out 3 days later from my desk neighbor Cora, who had worked at Hargrove for 4 years and treated her accumulated institutional knowledge like currency. "The guy from the elevator," she said when I described him. "Tall, dark, looks like he finds joy physically painful? That's the one. Barry Potter. He's on 16, corporate strategy. Came over from some consultancy about a year ago. Basically a ghost. Barely talks to anyone, eats lunch at his desk, never comes to floor parties." She paused. "Actually scary good at his job, from what I hear. Clients love him because he's never wrong. Colleagues tolerate him because he's never wrong." "What's he like?" Cora thought about it. "Imagine a glacier, but the glacier is also judging you." That was a very accurate description. I filed it away and told myself it didn't matter because Barry Potter existed on the 16th floor and I existed on the 14th. And the only thing connecting us was an elevator that I would simply not use when he was already in it. This plan lasted exactly 1 week. The elevator doors opened on 14 and I stepped in without looking because I was carrying a precarious stack of mock-up boards and a coffee and thinking about a tagline that wasn't working. And I didn't register the other occupant until the doors had already closed. Barry Potter stood in the back corner, looking at his phone, exuding his characteristic cold front energy. I faced forward. The silence was immediate and specific. The kind of silence that has texture. We were 11 floors from the lobby. I counted them. He got off on 2, the parking garage level, without a word. I exhaled so hard that a woman waiting in the lobby gave me a concerned look. That was October. By November, I had cataloged our encounters with the precision of someone who tells themselves they're not paying attention while absolutely paying attention. He took the elevator on Mondays and Fridays, usually between 8:15 and 8:30. He used the north stairwell when he was going up only 1 or 2 floors. He got coffee from the cart on the building's ground floor, not from the cafe across the street where most of us went, and he took it black, no hesitation, no customization. Just black coffee handed over in exchange for exact change he apparently kept ready in his jacket pocket. He held doors open with a kind of mechanical, impersonal courtesy, the way someone follows a rule they were taught rather than a kindness they feel. He never smiled. Not once, in all my watching, did I see his mouth do anything other than press into a thin, considering line. He was 31, according to Cora. He'd gone to some very good university for economics and then done a master's in strategic management. He ran every morning. She'd seen him in the park twice. He had no visible friends in the building. No personal items on his desk from what she could see through the glass partition when she'd had to drop something off on 16, and he had once. When asked at a department mixer if he was enjoying the event, said, "No, but thank you for asking," and walked away. He was, by every available metric, a person who did not want to be known. I don't know exactly when I started wanting to know him anyway. It crept up on me, the way the cold did that winter, gradually, and then all at once, until I was standing in it and wondering how I'd gotten there. The incident with the coffee happened in November during the first proper cold snap of the season, when the building's heating was still calibrating itself, and everyone on 14 was wearing their coats to their desks and complaining loudly about facilities management. I was at the ground floor cart, tucking my scarf back in, fumbling for my card, when I knocked my full cup off the counter with my elbow in the world's most avoidable accident. It hit the floor. The lid held for about half a second and then gave up. Oat milk latte everywhere. "Oh no," I said, to no one in particular, staring at the mess. "Oh, I'm so sorry." This to the cart vendor, who was already reaching for paper towels. "Allow me." I looked up. Barry Potter was standing beside me, crouched down before I'd fully processed his presence, collecting the empty cup, pressing the vendor's paper towels to the spill with a focused efficiency that suggested he had decided to solve this problem and was simply doing so. I stood there, useless. He straightened, handed the soiled towels to the vendor with a nod of thanks, looked at me, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time, and said with perfect neutrality, "You should get another one." Yes, obviously. I turned back to the cart, flustered and trying not to show it. "Sorry, do you want me to? Did it get on you?" A pause. I looked back. He was checking his sleeve with an expression of mild, resigned patience. There was a small dark splash at his cuff. My stomach dropped. "Oh no, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean." "It's fine." "It's not your jacket, it'll wash out." He said it like he was closing a door. Final, no argument required. I ordered another coffee, he ordered his black one. We stood in silence for the 12 seconds it took. He took his cup and walked toward the elevator. I thought that was the end of it. Except that the next morning when I arrived at the cart, the vendor, a cheerful man named Harold who'd worked the cart for 6 years and knew everyone's orders by the 3rd week, handed me a coffee I hadn't ordered. "Someone paid for it already," Harold said when I looked confused. "Who?" Harold just smiled in a way that suggested he was enjoying knowing something I didn't, and turned to help the next customer. I stood there holding the coffee and looked around the lobby. It was Barry Potter's order time. The lobby was busy. I didn't see him. I told myself it was probably a mix-up, that Harold had gotten confused, that it meant nothing. I told myself that with conviction for exactly 4 days, and then it happened again, and Harold gave me the same smile, and I thought, he's paying for my coffee. The coldest man in the building is paying for my coffee and acting like it's not happening. I didn't know what to do with that. So I did what I usually do with things I don't know what to do with. I put them in a corner of my mind and worried at them late at night when I should have been sleeping. It kept happening. Not every day, maybe twice a week, unpredictably. Never when I could catch him at the cart, never with any note or acknowledgement. Harold developed a smug little smile whenever he handed me a prepaid cup, and I developed the very specific frustration of having a gesture done for me by someone who refused to take credit for it. In December, I ran into Barry Potter in the elevator. Actually ran into him because I was walking fast and looking at my phone, and the doors opened, and I stepped in and our shoulders collided. My phone clattered to the floor. We both reached for it. Our hands touched, just briefly, just the backs of our fingers, and he drew back so fast you'd think the contact had burned him. He handed me the phone. We were both crouching. We were for one disorienting second exactly at eye level, very close, and I could see that his eyes weren't just gray. There was something warmer underneath buried. The way old stone holds heat from a sun that set hours ago. Then he stood, and the moment closed like water over a dropped stone, and he pressed the button for his floor and stood with his back to me, and I pressed mine, and we did not speak. But I thought about it for the rest of the day. The way he'd pulled back, the speed of it, like touching me, had been not unpleasant, just startling, like something that hadn't been planned for. I started to wonder if Barry Potter's coldness wasn't coldness at all, if it was something more like caution, something more like a person who has decided, for reasons of their own, that keeping their distance is safer than not. I wondered what had made him decide that. I wondered, more than was probably reasonable, what it would take for him to undecide it. January came and brought with it a new project. Hargrove had landed a major account, a corporate restructuring client, and for reasons that had to do with the client needing a unified strategy and messaging approach. The 14th and 16th floors were going to be collaborating. Small cross-department teams, working groups, shared presentation days. My manager, a brisk woman named Della who communicated primarily in bullet points, told me on a Monday morning that I was being seconded to a working group for the duration of the project. 6 weeks at minimum. I'd be going upstairs twice a week for joint sessions. The strategy lead on the client side is Barry Potter, she said, in the tone of someone relaying a weather forecast. He's difficult, but he knows what he's doing. Try not to take anything personally, I thought, too late. I thought, this is either going to be very good or catastrophically bad. The first joint session was on a Wednesday, in a glass-walled conference room on 16 that had a view of the city stretching out gray and cold and enormous. I arrived 2 minutes early. Barry Potter was already there, standing at the window, hands in his pockets, looking out at the skyline with the expression of someone doing calculations in their head. There were 6 of us in the working group, 3 from strategy, 3 from copy. We sat down. Barry took the chair at the head of the table. Not aggressively, just efficiently, as though he'd already identified the optimal position in the room, and distributed printed briefs with a quiet, methodical competence that made Cora, who'd been drafted alongside me, raise her eyebrows in what I recognized as reluctant appreciation. He ran the session the way I'd expected him to, precisely, without excess, asking questions that cut to the center of problems, offering assessments that were blunt but never cruel. He did not ask for opinions he wasn't going to use. He did not say "great point" when something wasn't a great point. When I offered a narrative framing for the client's messaging that I'd been thinking about all week, he listened to all of it without interrupting, which was more than I could say for the others, and then said, "That works for the external audience. The internal one needs something different. Can you run both?" It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't exactly not one either. "Yes," I said, "I can run both." He looked at me for a moment. That measuring look, the one I'd started to think was just how he looked at things he was trying to understand. And then he moved on. After the session, when everyone else was packing up and talking about lunch, I stayed to look at the whiteboard notes, wanting to make sure I'd captured everything correctly. The room emptied. I was copying down a diagram when I heard, from the doorway, "You pronounced the client's sector wrong in there." I turned. Barry was standing in the doorway, jacket on, ready to leave, and he was not looking at me with derision. He was looking at me the way someone looks when they're offering something they've decided is useful. "How should I say it?" I asked. He said it, slowly, clearly. I repeated it. He tilted his head, just barely, and what I was starting to suspect was his version of a nod of approval. "They're particular about it," he said. "The founder is, especially." Say it wrong in the client meeting and you lose credibility in the first 30 seconds. Thank you, I said. And because something in me had been waiting for the right moment, I added, and thank you for the coffee. Silence. A long, specific silence. I don't know what you mean, he said. He said it without any change in expression, without any hesitation, without any of the tells that normally accompany a lie. He said it like a person who has simply decided a thing isn't true and is living in that decision. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back, entirely composed. Okay, I said, my mistake. He left. I stood there with my notebook and thought, he's pretending it didn't happen. He did something kind, and now he's pretending it didn't happen. And something about that, the smallness of the kindness, the speed with which he'd buried it, made my chest hurt in a way I didn't have words for yet. The sessions continued through January. We fell into a rhythm. Not a warm one, not at first, but a functional one. We were good at working together in the way that two instruments that aren't in the same key can still make something that works if you arrange them right. He saw structure, I saw story. He asked good questions. I wrote answers people wanted to read. On the third week, he stayed late. I knew because I also stayed late. I had a deadline on a secondary piece unrelated to the working group. And I was in the break room on 16 because 14's kitchen had been commandeered by someone's birthday celebration and I couldn't concentrate. Barry came in around 7, looked at me sitting at the corner table with my laptop and my takeaway container and said nothing and poured himself a coffee and sat down at the other end of the table. We worked in silence for 40 minutes. It was the most comfortable silence I'd experienced in a long time. There's a particular quality to sharing space with someone who doesn't need to fill it, who isn't using the quiet to communicate anything except presence, and I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't expected. At one point, I muttered a frustrated noise at my screen, and without looking up, he said, "What's the problem?" Opening paragraph. "It's not landing. Read it to me." I looked up, surprised. He was still looking at his own screen, but there was an attentiveness in his posture that said he was listening. I read it. He was quiet for a moment. "You're starting with the company," he said. "Start with the person." I looked at my paragraph. He was right. Completely, simply, obviously right. "Start with the person," I said, and started rewriting. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't leave either. And when I finished and exhaled and said, "That's better," he made a small sound that I cataloged as agreement. We left the building at the same time, around 9, and walked in silence to the elevator, and he pressed the button for the lobby, and I thought about thanking him again, and decided not to push whatever this fragile, unnamed thing was. In the lobby, he held the door open, mechanically, as always, and we went our separate ways into the cold. I walked home in the dark with my hands in my pockets, and something warm, unreasonably warm, sitting in the center of my chest. February arrived exactly the way February always does, like a promise that's been broken so many times you've stopped expecting it to be kept, cold and gray and relentlessly gray. The umbrella incident happened on a Friday, which I only note because it was also the end of the 4th week of the working group, and something had been quietly shifting between us in those weeks. Nothing that could be named or pointed to, but a change in atmosphere, the way a room changes when someone opens a window somewhere out of sight. Barry had started saying my name when he addressed me in sessions, rather than the copywriter or a general question to the room. He'd sent me one email, one in all that time, that said only, "Good work on the client overview," and nothing else, no sign-off, no context, just those 4 words in an empty message field. And I'd read it approximately 14 times and felt 14 different things. On that Friday, it was raining. Not the dramatic theatrical rain of my first day, but the worst kind. Steady, cold, miserable. The kind that soaks through without you fully registering it until you're already wet. I'd checked the weather that morning and decided, in a fit of optimism, that it looked like it might clear up. It had not cleared up. The working group session ended at 5:30. Cora had left early for a dentist appointment. The others filed out. I gathered my things slowly because I was tired and also because I was going over a note I'd written myself about the client presentation. and by the time I got to the elevator, I was the last one from our group in the building. Barry was waiting for the elevator. I noticed the large black umbrella hooked over his arm. We rode down together in our usual silence. In the lobby, I could see the rain through the glass doors, silver sheets of it, the street outside obscured and gleaming. I dug in my bag automatically because I thought I might have, no umbrella. Of course, I'd done it again. I stood at the edge of the lobby. Barry stepped toward the doors. I thought I'd just wait it out, maybe 10 minutes, and it would ease. Then, where are you going? I turned. Barry was standing by the door, umbrella now open, inside the lobby, which made him look briefly, unexpectedly human, holding it at an angle that made no sense for a person about to walk out alone. Subway, I said, startled. North Side. He looked at me for a moment. Then he did something I can only describe as deciding, the way you can see someone arrive at a conclusion. A small shift in the set of his shoulders, a choice made and then immediately armored over. I go that way, he said. He did not go that way. His building, which I had established through careful and slightly embarrassing research, was west. The subway on the north side was not on his way anywhere. But I didn't say that. Something told me not to. We walked out together under his umbrella. It was a large umbrella, big enough for two, just if you walked close. We were close. The rain hammered the fabric above us and ran off the edges in thin rivers, and the city smelled like wet pavement and exhaust, and something that made me think inexplicably of autumn. Even though it was February and we were months from autumn, he held the umbrella. I was on his left. Our arms weren't quite touching. We walked for 3 blocks without speaking. The rain didn't stop. The city noise softened the silence into something almost comfortable. On the second block, I said, "Thank you for this." A pause. Then, "The rain is heavy," which was neither a deflection nor an acknowledgement. Which was, I was beginning to understand, Barry saying something true and peripheral, when a direct response would mean admitting to something he wasn't ready to admit to. On the third block, I said, "You don't have to walk me the whole way. The station's just at the corner." He stopped walking at the corner. We stood under the umbrella, the subway entrance a few feet away, and he held the umbrella over both of us, and we were looking at each other, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something. The expression on his face shifted, barely, like a cloud passing over water, and something that might have been something else moved behind his eyes. "Have a good weekend," he said. I went down into the station. I took the train home. I sat in my seat and thought about 3 blocks under an umbrella and the way he'd looked at me at the end, and by the time my stop came, I had arrived at something that felt like certainty. I was falling for Barry Potter. Had been falling, probably, since October. Had been choosing not to name it, the way you avoid naming something you're afraid won't survive being said aloud. On Monday, I passed him in the lobby. "Good morning," I said. "Good morning," he said, and kept walking. At the session that week, I said, "At the end, the walk helped last Friday, thanks," and he looked at me with perfect blankness and said, "What walk?" And there it was. The umbrella, gone. Like it had never happened. Like he had not walked 3 blocks in the rain going out of his way to keep me dry, and then stood at a subway entrance looking at me like he was solving a problem he couldn't name. He pretended it never happened. I went home. I sat on my kitchen floor, not for dramatic reasons, just because sometimes you need to be close to the ground when you're trying to think. And I thought, what do you do with a person who keeps doing kind things and then erasing them? What do you do with a person who is clearly feeling something and is clearly terrified of it? What do you do when you're terrified too, but you're more afraid of not finding out than you are of finding out? The working group was supposed to end after 6 weeks. Week 7 arrived because the client needed revisions, and nobody complained, including, I noticed, Barry, who could easily have delegated the revision work to one of his team members. Cora noticed. "Of course she did. He requested you specifically," she told me, in a low, delighted voice, on the morning of Week 7's first session. Della told me. The client asked for consistency in the messaging team, and Potter specifically said he wanted to keep the same copywriter. I told myself this was professional. I told myself very firmly. "Sammy," Cora said, looking at my face. What is happening? Nothing. Your nothing face looks like a something face. Drop it, Core. She didn't drop it, but she was kind enough to redirect, and I spent the rest of the morning telling myself very firmly that Barry Potter keeping me on a project was not a declaration, was not a gesture, was not anything to read into, and I did not hear a single word of it. The revision sessions were smaller, just me and Barry and one of his strategy analysts, a quiet man named Jeff who spent most of the meetings looking at his tablet and generally communicating that he was there under protest. Which meant that Barry and I were, effectively, working together almost alone. We were good at it. Better than I'd expected. Better, I think, than either of us had anticipated. There was a rhythm to it. Him laying out the structural argument, me shaping the language, both of us pushing back on each other when something wasn't right, neither of us taking the pushback personally. He was precise, and I was intuitive, and they shouldn't have fit together. But they did, the way two different tempos can lock into the same beat if you find the right moment. One afternoon, mid-February, we were working late again. Jeff had left at 6. It was just us, in the conference room on 16, the city dark outside, the table covered in marked-up documents. Barry was looking at the presentation structure, frowning in the way that meant he was finding a problem, and I was looking at him, looking at the problem. And I thought, I have been trying very hard not to look at you like this, and I'm not sure I can keep doing it. The third section contradicts the fifth, he said. I know, I said. I think the fifth needs to move. He tapped the table. Once, agreed without agreeing. Then, you do that a lot. Do what? Know the problem before you say it. You'll sit on something for a while, and then when you say it, you're already sure. I was quiet. This was, I realized, the most observational thing he had ever said to me. The most personal, in its way. The most evidence that he'd been watching the way I'd been watching. You do the same thing, I said. He looked at me. You know things before you say them, I continued. You've already solved it in your head. You just wait until you're certain. Something shifted on his face. Not a smile. Not quite, but something in the territory of one. The corner of his mouth. A loosening. Jeff thinks we're both insufferable, he said. Jeff is right, I said. And Barry Potter almost smiled. Full, real, almost there. And then he pressed it back like he'd caught himself and looked down at the documents again. But his jaw wasn't quite as tight as usual, and something in the room had changed its shape. 2 days later, the client meeting. It was the biggest session of the whole project. The full client team, the senior partners from both departments, a formal presentation with the finished strategy deck and messaging guide. Barry presented the strategy side. I presented the copy side. We'd prepared separately and together and in the car on the way to the client's offices. A company car. 3 of us plus Della and a senior partner from 16. I sat next to Barry and we went over the key points, his voice low, efficient, cutting to what mattered, and I thought, we are very good together. Whatever this is, whatever we are to each other right now, we are very good together. The meeting went well. Better than well. The client's CEO, who had a reputation for being difficult, shook my hand at the end and said the messaging was exactly what they needed. And looked at Barry and said, you two work well in that particular way that senior executives say things, without weight, but meaning every word. On the way back, Della and the senior partner sat in front. Barry and I were in the back seat. The city moved past outside. Everyone was a little loose with the relief of something difficult having gone well. Barry said quietly, just to me, you were right about the internal messaging. It landed better than I expected. You were right that the structure needed to hold the story, I said. It wouldn't have worked without that. A pause. Then, so quietly I nearly missed it, we were right. I looked at him. He was looking out the window. His profile, in the passing light of the city, was doing something to me that I was running out of room to file away. I said, Barry. He turned to look at me. Just looked. Why do you do that? I said. Do what? Pretend things didn't happen. The coffee, the walk, the things that are clearly you, that you do, and then you say you didn't. The question landed in the space between us. He was very still. This was, I realized, The most directly I had ever said anything to him, and I couldn't take it back, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, and it was the most transparent thing he had ever said, because this time his voice did change, just barely a shift in register, half a frequency drop. Like something trying to hold a shape it can't quite keep. "Okay," I said, the way I always said okay to him. But this time I was watching his face, and this time he knew I was watching, and neither of us pretended otherwise. The project ended, officially, finally, on a Thursday afternoon with the delivery of the final asset package and a brief, almost anticlimactic sign-off email from the client. Barry sent me a message that evening. First time he'd messaged me directly, not the group thread, just me. It said, "A good work. Aka." 2 words. I stared at them for a long time. Then I wrote back, "You too. Aka." 3 days passed. The working group was dissolved, everyone returning to their own floors, and I was back on 14, at my desk, back to regular projects and regular rhythms, and I kept waiting to feel relieved. Instead, I felt the particular hollowness of a space recently vacated by something important. I went back to the ground floor cart the following Monday. Harold handed me a prepaid coffee and didn't explain. I stood there with it and thought about what it meant that he was still doing this, now that we had no professional reason to be in each other's orbit. I thought about that all week. On Friday, I wrote a note, not a long one sentence, on a piece of notepaper. I went to 16 in the middle of the afternoon, when I knew from weeks of working there that Barry was in a one-on-one with his department head and his desk would be empty. The note said, "Stop pretending, please." I left it on his keyboard. No name, he would know. I went back to 14 and did the worst version of waiting, the kind where you don't let yourself expect anything and the hoping happens anyway, underground, without your permission. Nothing happened Friday. Nothing happened Monday. I went to the cart Tuesday and Harold didn't hand me a prepaid coffee, which told me something, though I wasn't sure what. On Wednesday he was in the lobby when I arrived. Not by the cart, just standing by the windows, hands in his pockets, looking out at the street. He turned when I came through the door. Turned toward me, specifically, the way you turn when you've been waiting for something. He looked tired. Not the tired of a bad night's sleep, but the tired of someone who has been doing a lot of internal work. "Walk?" he said. Just that. Just the one word, and I thought about 3 blocks in the rain, and the coffee that never happened, and 2 words in an email, and I said, yes. We walked outside. The February cold had eased slightly, not warm, but less sharp, one of those late winter mornings where the air hints at something it isn't ready to deliver yet. We walked without direction, side by side, not touching. He was quiet for a long time. I let the quiet be. "I'm not good at this," he said finally. "At what?" I said, though I knew. He stopped walking, briefly, resumed. "At allowing things. Allowing things to matter." I waited. "It's easier," he said, "when something doesn't happen, when it stays not a thing, because then you don't have to look at it. But it keeps happening," I said. A pause. "But it keeps happening." We walked another block in silence. I thought about asking directly and decided that wasn't what this needed. What it needed was patience, the kind that isn't passive, the kind that stays present, that doesn't fill the space but doesn't abandon it either. "I noticed you," he said, "on the first day. You were standing in the rain outside the building." I looked at him. "You were rude to me." I was. He said it without apology, but also without defense, like a fact he'd accepted. "I noticed you, and then I was rude, because..." He stopped, started again, "because I noticed you." Oh, the careful architecture of this man. The whole building of avoidance, constructed plank by plank to keep something in, rather than keep people out. "The coffee," I said. "The coffee," he agreed. "The walk." His jaw did the thing, the slight tightening. "The walk." "Why pretend?" I asked, not accusatorially, just wanting to understand the shape of it. He was quiet for a moment. We'd stopped walking, standing at the edge of a small square, bare-branched trees around us, the city murmuring its usual city murmur. Because if I didn't do them, they wouldn't exist, he said slowly, like he was working it out in real time. But if I admitted to them, then I would have done them. And I would have to be someone who does those things for a specific person. And that's frightening, I said. He looked at me. Yes. Something in my chest did a slow, careful thing, like a door opening inward. It's frightening for me too, I said, in case that helps. He was silent. The bare trees cast thin shadows on the pavement. Somewhere nearby, pigeons negotiated over something. Your note, he said. On my desk. Yes, I read it many times. What did you think? He turned to look at me fully, and his face, his controlled, deliberate, carefully managed face, was doing something I hadn't seen it do before. The careful architecture of it was still there, but something had been left open. A window, maybe. Just one, just enough. I thought, he said, that you were right, and that I was tired. We looked at each other. A gust of late winter wind moved between us, and he did something then that I think cost him quite a lot. He reached out and adjusted the collar of my coat, which had flipped up, settling it back against my neck, and his hand lingered for exactly 2 seconds before he withdrew it. I'd like to have lunch, he said, if you wanted to. I want to, I said. He nodded once in his Barry way, and then, because he was still Barry, he said, I know a place that does good coffee. I laughed, actually laughed, out loud in the winter square, and he looked at me with an expression of such careful, bewildered softness that I had to look away for a moment to collect myself. Lead the way, I said. Lunch was at a place he knew 3 blocks from the building, a small cafe tucked between a bookshop and a dry cleaner, not fashionable, not trying to be. The kind of place that has been exactly what it is for 20 years and will be for 20 more. He ordered black coffee and a sandwich with precise specifications and did not look at the menu, which told me he'd been here many times. I ordered something that turned out to be much larger than I'd expected, and he looked at it when it arrived and then looked at me with an expression I was starting to recognize as the closest he got to amusement. I thought I was hungry, I said. Apparently so. We ate. We talked. And this was new, was different, was the thing that undid me slightly. He talked. Not extensively, not without pauses, but genuinely, substantively, in the way of someone who has things to say and has been choosing for a long time to say them to nobody. He told me he'd grown up in a quiet town, the kind where people knew each other's business, and he'd decided very early that he'd rather be unknown, that he'd been good at school in a solitary way, good at math, good at the logic of things, not good at the parts that required performing himself for other people, that he'd done well professionally precisely because his coldness read his confidence, and he'd never fully decided whether to correct that impression. Do you want to? I asked. Correct it? He considered this, turning his coffee cup. I think I've been deciding that for the last few months, he said. I thought about October through February, about coffee cups and elevator silences and 3 blocks in the rain, about a note on a keyboard and a winter square and a collar gently resettled against a neck. I think you've been doing more than deciding, I said. Something happened in his expression, a kind of startled warmth, quickly managed but genuine. It was like watching the sun come out and retreat in the span of 3 seconds, a preview of something. We sat in the cafe for 2 hours. No one needed us anywhere. It was a Friday afternoon, the project was over, and the city outside did its city things while we sat across a small table and very carefully started the work of knowing each other. He asked about me, actually asked, specifically, the way someone asks who is paying attention, where I'd grown up, why copywriting, what I found hard. I answered with the slightly unguarded quality of someone who has been looked at rather than looked through, which is a disorienting and extraordinary feeling. I told him I'd grown up in a louder place than his. A big family, a crowded house, lots of voices. That I'd learned to be good with words partly to get a word in edgewise. That I found it hard to let things go. That I turned things over for a long time before I could put them down, which was maybe why I'd been turning him over for months. He was quiet when I said that. Then, I'm sorry for the months of it. Don't be, I said. I wasn't letting it go either. I noticed that, he said, and there was something in the almost dry tone of it that I recognized, with a lurch, as his version of warmth. The wry-adjacent version of Barry Potter at rest, not armored. I liked it so much, it scared me a little. We walked back to the building. At the door, the revolving glass door where we'd first met, though neither of us said so, he held it for me, and then stood with me in the lobby for a moment without the excuse of needing to be anywhere. Same time next week, he said. It wasn't a question, but it had a question underneath it. Yes, I said. He nodded, started toward the elevator. Barry, I said. He turned. I'm glad you held the umbrella. He looked at me for a long, still moment, and then, quietly, just barely, with the particular quality of someone doing something unfamiliar but determined, so am I. He got into the elevator. The doors closed. I stood in the lobby and felt the specific joy of something beginning. March arrived, and the city began its slow rehearsal for spring. Not warmth yet, but the suggestion of it, buds that didn't open, afternoons that arrived 10 minutes later than yesterday. We had lunch on Fridays, then Wednesdays too, then a Tuesday, because he'd sent a message. He messaged more now, brief and irregular, like radio signals from a station still calibrating its frequency, asking if I wanted to see a documentary about urban infrastructure that was playing at a small cinema near his building, and I had said yes before I finished reading the message. The documentary was genuinely interesting. Also possibly the least romantic film choice in the history of film choices, which I found completely and entirely right. Barry watched it with the focused attention he brought to everything and occasionally leaned slightly toward me to make a quiet observation, and I kept very still beside him in the dark theater and tried to simply be present in the fact of it rather than racing ahead to what it meant. He walked me to the subway afterward, this time without rain, without an umbrella, without any practical justification at all. Just walking beside me through the city at night, hands in our respective pockets, the streets doing their evening things around us. He was still quiet, still careful, but the quality of the quiet had changed. It wasn't the defensive quiet of someone keeping something back, but the quieter quiet of someone who is comfortable in saying so through their presence. He was telling me something without words. I am here. I chose to be here. This is not accidental. I was learning him. The way he tilted his head when he was considering something, the half-second delay before he said something he decided to be honest about, the way he drank his coffee, always black, always in both hands when he was thinking, one hand when he was listening, that he read in the evenings, physical books, dense non-fiction mostly, though he'd admitted once, with the air of someone confessing to a minor crime, that he occasionally read crime novels on planes, that he kept his apartment very tidy, which I learned because he mentioned once that he found a mess difficult to think in and I'd filed it away as a key, that he touched things carefully, always carefully, as though the world had a texture he was testing. I noticed this because he was, slowly and painstakingly, getting better at touching me, not in dramatic ways. This wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of story where things tip over into grand gestures. It was small. A hand on my shoulder when he moved past me in a narrow space. His shoulder against mine in a shared doorway, neither of us adjusting. His hand at my elbow once when I almost stepped off a curb wrong, and then withdrawn, but not hastily, carefully, like he'd done it and decided it was okay, and then let go, rather than flinching away. Cora, who had appointed herself the keeper of this particular ongoing dramatic serialization, was insufferable about it. He sought you out at the coffee cart yesterday, she reported, with the energy of someone filing a breaking news bulletin. He was getting coffee. He walked past the cart toward the elevator, saw you at the cart, and turned around. You watched him turn around? I observe everything. Did he talk to you? He had, in fact. We'd stood at the cart and talked for 8 minutes about the city's infrastructure documentary and then about a book I'd mentioned and whether it was worth reading. And Harold had given me my coffee with the most satisfied expression known to mankind. And Barry had paid for his own, and I'd thought maybe we'd moved past that, except when I'd opened my bag to get my card. He'd already handed Harold cash for both of us and was looking at the street, and when I'd said, "Barry," he'd said with complete equanimity, "Have a good morning, Sammy," and walked away. I told Cora none of this. He asked about the documentary. He asked about you, she said. And you're both incredibly bad at this for entirely different reasons. What's my reason? You're too patient. You keep leaving room for him to retreat, and then he takes it. I thought about this. Maybe that's what he needs. Maybe, she said, but you're allowed to need things too. This was a fair point. I sat with it. The thing about patience is that it isn't passive. I want to be clear about that, because I think when you decide to be patient with someone, it can look from the outside like waiting, like accepting, like making yourself smaller. But real patience, the kind that holds a space rather than fills it, takes work. It takes choosing every day not to rush the thing because you're afraid of how much you want it. That is what I did with Barry. I kept showing up. I kept being myself, clearly and without apology, so that he knew what he was walking toward. I talked to him and let the silences be comfortable and occasionally pushed back when he retreated too far. Not to pull him forward, but to let him know the door was still there. In April, I made a misstep. We were at lunch, and I was telling him something funny that had happened at work, and he was doing his Barry almost smile, and I was so comfortable, so genuinely delighted to be in the middle of that specific conversation with that specific person that I reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. Just the top of his hand, 2 fingers a second of contact. The kind of thing I do without thinking with people I'm comfortable with. He went still. Not a flinching away still, a different still. The kind where you've stopped because something has happened that requires processing. I pulled my hand back. "Sorry," I said. "I didn't mean." "Don't apologize," he said. His voice was very even. His hand was still where it had been, on the table. I waited. He picked up his coffee cup, looked at it. "I'm not." He started, stopped. "I find it harder than most people do. Touch. It's not." Another stop. "It's not that I don't want it. It's more that I don't trust it," I offered. He looked at me. "Don't trust myself in it," he said, "which is different." I considered this carefully. It was, I thought, the most honest thing he'd said to me yet. More honest than the walk or the almost smile or the single admission in the Winter Square. "Okay," I said, "I'm working on it." "I know." And then, because it was true and I wanted to say it, "There's no rush." He looked at me for a moment, then, "Thank you." Not for the patience, we didn't name it. But the thank you meant it, and we both knew what it meant, and that was enough. Enough at least, until May. The building had an end-of-spring event, not quite a party, more a gathering. The kind of corporate-adjacent social exercise that everyone attends out of a vague sense of obligation and spends the whole time pretending to be more comfortable than they are. Rooftop, because the building had a rooftop terrace, late on a Friday evening, the city below doing its evening city things. Barry, famously, never came to these things. I knew this. I went anyway, because I liked Cora and some of the others, and because it was a nice evening, clear and warm for the first time, and the rooftop had a view worth having. He was there. I saw him from across the terrace, standing near the edge, drink in hand, doing his characteristic thing of existing in a room without appearing to need it. He wasn't talking to anyone. But he was there. I went over. "You came," I said. "You're surprised. Not defensive. Observational. A little." He looked at the view. The city at early evening, all that light starting to come on. I thought I would try it. "The event?" A pause. "Being here." I stood beside him, and we looked at the city, and I thought, he came to an event he never attends, on a Friday evening, and the only person he's been seen talking to is me. And I thought, I know what this is. I've known for a while. I've just been waiting for him to catch up. But maybe, I thought, he's caught up. Maybe he's been catching up and I'd been so careful, so patient, so determined not to rush, that I've missed the moment when he arrived. I turned to look at him. He was looking at the city, his profile in the evening light, and he looked different on a rooftop in May than he had in an elevator in October. Not different the way a person changes. but different, the way familiar music sounds when you finally know all the words, the same and fuller at once. Barry, I said. He turned. There was a long moment. The city murmured below us. Someone laughed across the terrace. The warm air moved between us, and he was looking at me with that expression, the one I'd seen in fragments for months, the one that was buried beneath all the careful architecture, and it was not buried anymore. Just there, just open, just him. I'm gonna say something, I said. All right. I like you, specifically. I like how your mind works, and the way you pay attention, and the fact that you read crime novels on planes and pretend you don't. And I like being in rooms with you, and I like being quiet with you. And I've been patient because I wanted you to find your way to this, rather than feeling pushed. But I paused. I think I'd like to know if you're there, if you want to be. He was very still. I'm there, he said. His voice was low even, but it was not flat. There was something underneath it, warm and careful and real. I've been there for quite a while. Since when? He thought about it. A second. 2. October, he said, standing in the rain. My chest did something I couldn't have narrated. You were rude to me, I said. I know. The barest flicker of something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite amusement, but was somewhere between. I was frightened. Of me? Of what I felt, standing 3 feet from you, in the first 5 seconds. He was looking at me very directly. Very level direct, which was to say completely, without evasion. I don't feel things quickly. Or rather, I feel them and then I spend a great deal of time rationalizing them into something manageable. You didn't feel manageable. I'm not sure if that's a compliment. It's the most significant thing I know how to say, he said quietly. The city did its city things below us, the terrace murmured. And we were standing very close to each other on a rooftop in May, and he reached up, slowly and deliberately, in the careful way he touched the world, and put his hand against my jaw. Warmth of it, weight of it. I leaned into it, just barely. I'd like to take you to dinner, he said. Properly, not lunch. Dinner. Yes, I said. Tomorrow? Yes. He didn't kiss me. Not on the rooftop, not in front of the whole building, not in this first tentative opening of what we were becoming. That was also very Barry, and I loved it. He lowered his hand. We stood at the edge of the terrace and watched the city go gold in the last of the evening light, and his arm was against mine, and neither of us moved away. Dinner was at a quiet place he knew. Better than quiet, actually. Genuinely excellent. The kind of restaurant that doesn't advertise itself and requires knowing. He'd made a reservation. He'd thought about it. When I mentioned I didn't eat red meat, he said he'd already asked for the menu to be adjusted, and I sat across from him in the warm light of that place and thought, you planned this carefully. You thought about what I'd need, and you did it without announcing it, without wanting credit, without making it a thing. He was, I realized, a person who cared very deeply and very quietly, who had spent a long time convinced that deep quiet caring was indistinguishable from not caring, or worse, a liability, something that could be used, something that made you visible in ways you hadn't chosen. Over dinner he told me about a relationship he'd had, years ago, someone who'd used his certainty against him, who'd taken his careful, deliberate quality and read it as stiffness, inflexibility, incapacity, who had told him, at the end, that he wasn't capable of being close to people, that he was too in his head, too controlled, too much. He said it with clinical clarity, the way he said everything, but his hands were flat on the table in a way that wasn't quite relaxed. You don't believe that, I said. I believed it for a long time. What changed? He looked at me. The restaurant light was kind, warm, and in it he looked younger and more tired and more real than I'd ever seen him. Someone paid attention, he said, and kept paying it, even when I made it difficult. I thought about October through May, about patience that was a choice, about room left open, about the particular endurance of staying present for someone who kept arriving in pieces. You were worth paying attention to, I said. He looked down at his wineglass, back at me. You're very... He stopped. What? You're very much yourself, he said, at all times. I find it very. He stopped again, but this time it was the stop of someone editing down to the right word, not the stop of avoidance. Remarkable, he said. I find it remarkable. We stayed at dinner for 3 hours. We walked back through the evening city side by side, and at some point his hand found mine, found it deliberately, thoughtfully, no accident, and held it. His hand was warm. I hadn't expected it. Somehow, I'd always imagined Barry's hands would be cold, but they were warm, and they held mine with a precision that was also a tenderness, and I thought, there you are. There is the person who was always underneath. At my building, the walk again going out of his way again, not pretending otherwise this time. He stopped, and we faced each other. And he was looking at me the way he'd been looking at me since October, except that now it was uncovered. No armor, just him, just the real version. He kissed me, quietly, carefully, with his hand still holding mine and the other at the back of my neck, and it was exactly as deliberate and as warm as everything he did when he was finally, truly doing it. When he pulled back, he looked at me with something on his face that I could only describe, inadequately, as peace, like something had settled. "Good night, Sammy," he said. "Good night, Barry." He walked away into the city. I watched him go. Tall, impeccable, slightly less armored than he'd been in October. A man learning to leave doors open. And I stood on my front step and breathed the warm May air and felt something that I'd never had a perfect word for. The specific happiness of a thing you were patient for, arriving exactly as you hoped. It's summer now. The city is warm and wide open, and the trees in the square where we stopped in February are full of leaves. Barry still gets black coffee from the ground floor cart. He still walks fast and holds doors open in that impersonal, mechanical way. He still doesn't come to floor parties as a general rule, though he appeared at the summer one last month for 45 minutes, which Cora reported to me with the energy of someone filing a landmark legal ruling. He is still quiet, still precise, still the person in the room most likely to find the structural flaw in an argument before anyone else and least likely to announce it theatrically. He still does not say he's done a kind thing. He still sometimes pretends for approximately 30 seconds before he remembers that we've agreed we don't do that. Last week, it rained. I had my umbrella. The new one, the proper one. I finally bought, no broken ribs, no list to the left. He had his. We were walking to lunch in the rain, and at some point we'd instinctively moved under the same one. Mine closed in my bag, his covering us both, because of course we had. I looked at him. He looked at me, a particular look. The one that contains, these days, quite a lot. "The umbrella," I said, a long pause. Then, with the gravity of a man making a formal concession, "The umbrella," he said. "You pretended it never happened." I was frightened. He said it easily now, had gotten better at this, at naming the things underneath without having to armor over them first. "What were you frightened of?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the rain hit the pavement ahead of us, the city blurring softly in the downpour. "That you'd see it," he said. "The umbrella. That you'd see what it meant, and then you'd—" He stopped. I wasn't sure I was ready to mean something. I thought about that, turned it over. "And now?" I asked. He looked at me. Rain on the umbrella above us, the city around us, warm in the middle of all of it. "Now," he said, "I think I'd like to keep meaning something, if that's all right with you." "It's all right with me," I said. He took my hand. We walked on through the rain. The umbrella was big enough for two. It always had been. I think he knew that, even in October, even before he was ready to know it. I think the umbrella was always an answer looking for the right question. I think Barry Potter, the coldest man in the building, has always had more warmth in him than he knew what to do with. And all he needed was someone willing to stand in the rain long enough to prove it. I was willing. I am. That's the whole story. That's all of it. That, and the umbrella, which happened, and which neither of us pretends otherwise. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon, link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.